Hi, my name is Angelina Liu. I go by Lazarus on EDX and Angelina Y. Liu on GitHub. Today is July 15th, 2024, and I will be presenting about the Real Estate Wealth Network data breach that happened in December of 2023. I chose this topic because it was a massive breach that leaked 1.5 billion records, including those of A-list celebrities like Elon Musk, Britney Spears, Donald Trump, and many others. So I found this quite interesting. This relates to the course very closely because the practices the company were using were pretty lackluster, and the data breach could have been prevented through a variety of the methods we learned about in this course, like password protection and encryption and others. So, with that, let's take a look at the actual incident itself. So just a brief introduction and overview. In December of 2023, a cybersecurity researcher by the name of Jeremiah Fowler discovered an unprotected database that contained over 1.5 billion records, that's billion with a B, related to real estate ownership. And this database belonged to a company named Real Estate Wealth Network and contained highly sensitive information that was organized into various folders, sorted by things like property history, motivated sellers, bankruptcy, divorce, tax liens, foreclosure, HOA liens, inheritance, court judgments, obituaries, vacant properties, and much more. It also contained personal information like names, addresses, phone numbers, and purchase details. Now, obviously, this is a massive security issue, certainly for regular people, but especially for notable names like Elon Musk, Kylie Jenner, Donald Trump, Mark Wahlberg, Dolly Parton, and other A-list celebrities whose privacy is already vulnerable. And if you look at this picture to the bottom right, this was an image provided by Fowler in his report showing some of the information he was able to access from the database. And these highlighted words are some very recognizable names whose information was accessible through this data breach. So, what actually caused these circumstances to occur? Overall, the most prominent issue was the lack of password protection on the database, which left the personal information of millions of people open to public access. A second notable mistake was the lack of encryption of the data. So even if someone gained access to the database, it should have been unreadable without the decryption key. And this key should have been stored separately from the encrypted data with strict access controls so that nobody unauthorized got their hands on it. Now, just a combination of these two things would have made it much more difficult for an attacker to access the data in the first place and even then be able to interpret it. But although encryption and password protection are the main two issues at play here, there are definitely other security measures the company could have implemented to make sure their data was being handled securely, so that even if encryption or password protection failed, there were other safeguards in place to make sure the data was still protected. For example, there were no firewalls either segmenting the networks, which would have contained any authorized access attempts, or performing deep packet inspection to block unauthorized data transfers. And finally, all of these weaknesses were likely the result of a lack of vulnerability assessments. Had Real Estate Wealth Network put together a team to identify weaknesses in their database or anywhere they could have possibly compromised information, they almost certainly would have found this hole in their security. But without anyone looking out for this, it went unnoticed until a third party found it, in this case Jeremiah Fowler and possibly other malicious attackers beforehand. So let's take a look at what Real Estate Wealth Network could have done differently to prevent this from happening. So some recommendations. The first major thing is to establish password protection. Seems simple, but this isn't just as easy as storing the passwords in a notepad document next to their username and checking that, since the password database can also be breached. So it's important to hash the passwords using an algorithm to scramble them, then adding salt to randomize the hash. And this prevents attackers from using rainbow tables or pre-computed tables of hashes in the case of two users having the same password, since the attacker needs to recompute the hash with the randomized salt for each user. This, at the minimum, would have ensured that there was some level of security here to prevent someone from just discovering and accessing the database. And additionally, implementing multi-factor authentication adds an extra layer of security by requiring a user to verify their identity through a second method, like a code sent to their phone or an authentication app. Password policies as well should mandate a strong password that are hard to guess, with either a variety of characters like upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and special symbols, and a minimum password length, or alternatively, a long string of several words that would be easy for the user to remember but difficult to guess through brute force. And if you look at this table here, you can see how long it would take to brute force a password based on the types of characters used and the length of the password. We can see that with 15 characters, that would be 3 5-letter words for instance, it would take roughly 1,000 years to guess this password through brute force, which is pretty good considering it's quite an easy password to remember. A more complicated password with numbers and symbols and substitutions, which is much more difficult to remember, might encourage the user to use that same password across multiple platforms, which would leave them vulnerable to credential stuffing attacks. So both options work well here for different reasons. As you can also see, using a variety of characters does make it a lot harder to brute force. It increases the time quite significantly. As for encryption, using a strong symmetric encryption algorithm like AES 256 here, as you can see a model of to the right, would have done the trick to encrypt this data, ensuring that even if someone gained access to the database, they couldn't actually read what it said without the decryption key. Another thing Real Estate Wealth Network could have done is implement firewalls that can perform deep packet inspections and network segmentation. In the case of a breach, segmented networks would prevent the breach from reaching other areas of sensitive information, essentially containing the threat. A deep packet inspection looks at the data and headers of each packet passing through the network and identifies and blocks anything suspicious. So in this case, DPI, deep packet inspection, could have detected abnormal behavior like massive data requests from a single IP address, which would have triggered alerts to block the traffic and not allow the attacker to gain access to the data. And finally, performing security audits and vulnerability assessments much earlier on would have prevented this from being an issue in the first place. This means reviewing security policies and access controls, and also performing penetration testing to identify weaknesses. Now, although this data breach was found by an ethical hacker, it's not certain whether or not a malicious person found this data beforehand and used it for harm. Penetration testing allows companies to find vulnerabilities in their system early so that they can be fixed before they're exploited. And simply discovering that there was no encryption or password protection on this massive database would have allowed for an easy fix much earlier in the process, keeping the personal information of millions of people safe and private. So that's all I have for this. Thank you for listening. I hope this was informative. And yeah, have a great day.